Tonight, I'm Reverend Dean Planner from church here. Our college ministry is sponsoring the debate tonight, and we're glad to. I do want to make a couple of announcements before we initiate the debate. Back, Dr. Gish brought some books with him. They're from the Institute of Creation Research, and during intermissions, you're welcome to look at that book. All the proceeds go back into the Institute for Creation Research, and the prices are there. There are some free information there. Acts and Facts, we want you to take one if you like. Also, you can order a subscription to Acts and Facts, the green card here. Someone asked about tape. We're not selling tapes as a money-making thing at all. We, just as information, we're all taping the events, and we won't know the price yet. But if you'll just write Westside Baptist Church in Emporia, if you're interested in an audio tape, then we'll get you the price information and so forth. We're not in it for any kind of program. We're just wanting to get the information out. It's my privilege, and of course you have your programs, and you're able to see the resume of each of the men involved. We appreciate the cooperation of the college here in setting up the events here tonight, and appreciate the moderator tonight is Steve DePoe, and Steve is the debate coach here at Emporia State University, and we're glad that he was able to be here and to participate in the debate. And Dr. Gish over here on my right, and Dr. Nelson on my left, and Dr. DePoe, or I guess you're not a doctor yet. Not yet, all right. Mr. Steve DePoe, Professor Steve DePoe, will be doing the moderating as a debate coach tonight. And I hope you'll give undivided attention. Something that isn't on the program, there will be a 5-minute break after the first thesis statement. There will be a 5-minute break then, and that isn't on the program. All right, Steve.
Good evening. My interest in this debate sprang from a master's thesis that I wrote at Northwestern University on the issue of the evolution-creation debate. I'm real excited to have two scholars in this area on the Emporia State campus tonight to discuss the issues. What I want to do very briefly is tell you some of the ground rules for the debate. Each gentleman has his own personal timer, and we will try to time the speeches pretty carefully. We have a young lady in the front row that's also going to keep time. After each person is through with a given speech, I will stand up and briefly introduce the next speaker so that the gentleman that was just through speaking can get a chance to sit down and get a drink of water and get his pad and pencil out to take notes. At the very end of the presentation, in what is called the forum, I will field questions from you for the speakers. And what we will do is we'll begin with a question for Dr. Gish. You can ask a question. I'll give him a couple of minutes to answer, and then I'll give Dr. Nelson a couple of minutes to respond, and then Mr. Nelson will field a question, and we'll just go back and forth for 30 or 45 minutes or so at the very end. Please try to give your undivided attention to these gentlemen. It's going to be a long evening, but we have tried to break it up with a couple of intermissions, so I think it'll be very enjoyable. It'll be kind of a multimedia presentation, as both of these gentlemen have become thoroughly prepared on the subject over the years, and I know they'll give you a very thorough and interesting presentation. So let me first introduce the first speaker, Dr. Duane Gish, who will give the first thesis statement for 60 minutes. Dr. Gish.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. DePoe. Dr. Nelson, ladies and gentlemen, certainly it's my pleasure to be here with you this evening to have this opportunity of presenting for your consideration the scientific case for creation. Now, let me state, first of all, what is not at issue here this evening. I do not believe that the age of the universe, the age of the earth, is one of the issues to be debated this evening. Now, it is an important question, but I think we should have on another occasion, we need a full hour to discuss such a topic. I do not believe that's the primary question here, because, as a matter of fact, some creationists believe that the earth is very old and some believe that it's quite young. And so even among the creationists there's a difference of opinion on that particular issue. Now furthermore, biblical creation is not in question here tonight. The creation scientists have no intention of going into the public schools and teaching the book of Genesis, but merely the nature of the scientific evidence which I will be discussing tonight. That is what creation scientists would like our students to hear. We'd like for them to have the opportunity to hear both sides of this question from a scientific point of view. Surely the theology of Henry Morris is not an issue here. Quite often in my debates, the other debater will be quoting Dr. Morris and some of his theological ideas. That's not an issue here. The only issue is this: what is the best explanation for the origin of the universe and the living things it contains? Creation or evolution? How did things come to be? Were they generated internally? Was it by a process of self-transformation due to natural processes which can be ascribed to properties inherent in matter? Or was the complexity, the order, the structure, and information contained within our natural universe introduced from the outside, therefore by a supernatural agency? That is a question that is to be debated here this evening. Now, the late Professor Harlow Shapley, an astronomer at Harvard University, said that some people proclaim in the beginning God. I say in the beginning hydrogen. Professor Shapley believed that starting with hydrogen gas and natural laws and processes that are now operating in the natural universe, it would be possible to explain the origin of everything. You see, one of the more popular theories on the origin of the universe is the notion that all the energy and matter in the entire universe, everything in your body, everything in this building, everything in the universe, was crammed together in a huge cosmic egg of electrons, protons, neutrons, and various radiation and particles. Nobody has the foggiest notion where the cosmic egg came from or how it got there. Someone suggested the cosmic chicken may have laid the cosmic egg. Well, it's as good as explanation as I've heard yet. But there it was, and for some equally inexplicable reason, it exploded. Now, out of that explosion, a relatively short time later, hydrogen gas was generated. And this hydrogen gas expanded out into the vast stretches of the universe. That was the universe at that time. That's all there was, just hydrogen gas. Well, there's a minor amount of helium, but that's immaterial. Just this gas. Now, according to evolutionists then, stars and galaxies, our solar system, and living things have generated themselves, have created themselves, starting with hydrogen gas. We've gone from hydrogen gas to people. A friend of mine, Professor George Mulfinger, said, well, if that's true, then we could say that hydrogen is an odorless, tasteless, invisible gas, which, if given sufficient time, becomes people. And that is precisely what evolutionists believe. They really do believe that. Now, as a scientist, I find that incredible. Absolutely, totally incredible to believe such a thing. Here we are, people. 30 trillion cells in our bodies of over 200 varieties, including 12 billion brain cells in our 3-pound human brain, with 120 trillion connections. The most complex arrangement of matter known in the universe. We are the products of hydrogen gas, according to the theory of evolution. Everything in the universe is a product of this hydrogen gas. Our consciousness, our ability to think, to plan for the future, our very faith in God is nothing but the product of this evolutionary process, according to this theory. I propose to show that evolution theory violates some of the most well-established laws known in science. I suggest further that the notion that our marvelously complex, highly ordered universe and the incredibly complex living things that it contains originated by chance processes is simply preposterous. This is nothing more than pseudoscientific 20th century mythology, a nature myth that man has invented to explain his origin without God. Finally, I propose to show that the fossil record, which is the history of life, if there is such a thing, which of course should provide unequivocal evidence for evolution, if evolution is really true, that this record is terribly embarrassing to evolution theory, but provides powerful, positive evidence for creation. Now let me define what I mean by creation. Now there's different kinds of creationists. There's some who believe in a recent creation. There's some who believe in an old creation. There's some who believe in a six-day creation. There's some who believe that creation took place in stages over a vast stretch of time. And there are other kinds of creationists. And there are a variety of evolutionists. There are people who believe in the hopeful monster mechanism. There's the people who believe in jerky evolution. There's people who believe in slow, gradual Darwinian evolution. There's evolutionists who even believe in Lamarckianism today. But there are these two basic views of origin. One, internal, self-transformation. Totally naturalistic and mechanistic. It doesn't make any difference whether the evolutionist believes in God or not. God didn't have anything to do with the process. He wasn't necessary. He wasn't involved. Maybe he's out there somewhere. But he wasn't necessary. Matter was sufficient to do it all. Then there is the creationist explanation, externally directed, supernaturally performed by the Creator. By creation we mean then that the universe was created by someone or something external to it, independent of the natural universe, who brought things into being directly. That he created the stars and the galaxies, our solar system. He created life on this planet. And each basic type of plant and animal, which we could call basic morphological designs, we could call them basic types, we could call them created kinds, whatever. They're separate, distinct, created types, none of which arose from a common ancestor. Dogs are always dogs and have always been dogs. Cats have always been cats. Onions have always been onions, and people have always been people, having been brought into being directly by the acts of a creator. Now, people ask, well, which creation do you want to put in the schools? The Judeo-Christian or the Hindu or the Havasu Indian? We say none of those. We don't want any religious literature to be introduced into public schools, only the scientific evidence which supports creation. That is the basic creation model. Now, the basic evolution model, and I mentioned there are various kinds of evolutionists. I don't know whether Dr. Nelson is a Darwinist or whether he's a hopeful monster or whether he's believes in punctuated equilibrium or Lamarckianism, but he supports a basic evolution model. I'm going to let Sir Julian Huxley define that for us, and now I need the changer. Do you have the... All right, bring that over to me. Yes. Right, I'm going to let Sir Julian Huxley define evolution for us. Julian Huxley was the grandson of Thomas Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog. He's one of the chief architects of the modern neo-Darwinian theory of evolution. You ought to know what he's talking about. Now see what Huxley says in his definition of evolution. Huxley says, and this was published in What is Science, published in 1955, Huxley says, evolution in the extended sense can be defined as a directional and essentially irreversible process occurring in time, which in its course gives rise to an increase of variety and an increasingly high level of organization in its products. our present knowledge indeed forces us to the view that the whole of reality is evolution, a single process of self-transformation. End of quote. All right? Notice, evolution is a process of self-transformation. No external agent is necessary or involved, God or otherwise. Matter, hydrogen gas was sufficient to do it all. Notice that it includes everything in the universe, everything. Notice that it's a directional process, supposedly starting with primordial chaos and disorder generated by the primordial explosion, going from the simplicity of hydrogen gas to your brain with its 120 trillion connections. So we've gone in that direction. Everything in the universe has been generated by this process of self-transformation. Now, let us think about this for a moment. These two basic models of origins. What would we expect to find as scientists out there in the real world? Not in our theories, not in our imagination or dreams, but out there in the real world. Well, if this has happened, then certainly we would expect matter to have this intrinsic ability to transform itself from simple to complex, from disorder to order. That must be true if evolution is true. It must be all pervasive. It must be all unfailing, because we have generated everything in the universe from hydrogen gas through this process. Matter must have that ability. Scientists would have identified it. They would have constructed a natural law to describe such a tendency of matter. That doesn't mean that everything goes in that direction, but there is a tendency to go in that direction. Now, on the other hand, if creation is true, we would not expect that matter would have an ability to promote itself to ever higher and higher levels of organization in its product. We would not predict, we would not expect that at all. But if something has happened since creation to change the initial created state, the change can only be downward. We might expect that matter would have a tendency to go from order to disorder, from complex to simple. That might be something that we would detect in the properties of matter, but never the reverse. Now, those are very fair predictions. I've never had anyone question those. Now, let us go out in the real world and just take a look. And that's all science is. Science is just common experience. We just go out there in the real world as it now exists. We see what's going on and we try to explain it. So let's do that. Let's go out in the world and take a look. Let's see what we find. First of all, let me point out that no scientist has ever detected any inherent tendency of matter to go from simple to complex, from disorder to order. Ladies and gentlemen, we do not have a natural law which describes such a property of matter. It's not known in science. But scientists have detected precisely the opposite tendency. There is a universal natural tendency for all systems to go from order to disorder, from complex to simple. That's true of all systems. The scale of the galaxies down to the level of the molecules, our houses, our bodies, everything tends to go in that direction. I don't care whether you're talking about an isolated system, an open system, or what kind of a system you're talking about. The tendency is always to go in that direction. I'm going to let Dr. Isaac Asimov define this for us, or describe the implications or the consequences of this universal tendency, so all-pervasive, so universal, it's called a natural law, the second law of thermodynamics. All right, as Dr. Asimov says, quote, another way of stating the second law then is the universe is constantly getting more disorderly. Viewed that way, we can see the second law all about us. We have to work hard to straighten a room, but left to itself, it becomes a mess again, very quickly and very easily. Even if we never enter it, it becomes dusty and musty. How difficult to maintain houses and machinery and our own bodies in perfect working order. How easy to let them deteriorate. In fact, all we have to do is nothing. And everything deteriorates, collapses, breaks down, wears out, all by itself. And that is what the second law is all about. End of quote. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it seems to me if that is what the second law is all about, then evolution is in trouble, very serious trouble. You see, we do have a natural tendency, we do have a natural law of this universe, but it's going in the opposite direction required by the theory of evolution. Our sun is exhausting its fuel. It will not last forever. The day will come when it will have burned up all of its fuel. That is, if there is no God, or if God would not choose to intervene, the universe has one certain destiny: it's going to die. Because the day will come, quite obviously, when every star and every galaxy in the entire universe will have burned up its fuel. They will grow cold and dark. The universe will assume one even temperature. There'll be no energy exchange, no activity, no life. That is the certain destiny of this universe if there is no God. Now, my question is this, and I've asked it again and again and again. I've never had an answer. If the natural laws and natural processes which are now governing the universe are leading inexorably to its destruction and death, and if, as evolutionists believe, that's all there is and all there ever has been, how then could those very same natural laws have created the universe in the first place? Now, is it possible? Really now, is it possible for the very same natural processes that are destroying the universe could have been responsible for its origin in the first place? How would anyone ever reach such an impossible conclusion? What sort of tortured logic would one have to use to reach such a conclusion? The creation scientist says that's clearly impossible. Now, one thing certain about the second law of thermodynamics, it does apply to an isolated system. An isolated system is a system on which no work is being performed by anything on the outside. It's a system into which nothing is being brought in from the outside. The second law of thermodynamics says that system will go in one direction and one direction only, and that's downward. It would deteriorate. It would become more random. It will constantly lose the structure, the complexity, the information contained within that system will constantly deteriorate. It will never, absolutely never, never, never increase in order, complexity, structure, and information. Never. Absolutely, it's a natural law, the most well-established law known in science. And yet, evolutionists believe the universe is an isolated system, which started in a state of primordial chaos and transformed itself without any outside help into the present universe, which is obviously highly complex, structured, and ordered. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is a physical impossibility. That cannot happen. The creation scientist says the universe is not an isolated system. There is something, someone, or something external to it, therefore what we call supernatural, that had to be responsible for its origin. Since the universe could not have created itself naturally, it must have been created supernaturally. It is irrational, it is unscientific to believe that the universe created itself. Therefore, evolution is impossible. The universe could not have created itself, could not have evolved. There's no question about it. And so it had to be created supernaturally. Now let us leave this subject of thermodynamics, and I'm sure we'll get back to it in the rebuttal and the question and answer period in more detail. Is it physically possible in the 10 to 20 billion years that evolutionists assume the universe has existed for all of the incredible order, complexity, structure, and organization found within this universe to have arisen by chance. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I don't care what anybody tells you, ultimately all of evolution is due to chance, pure chance. Certainly because before you have living cells, there could be no natural selection. Everything is functioning according to physics and chemistry, and everything that happens is random according to these physics and chemistry. No purpose, no intelligence, no biochemist, nothing like that there. Even after you have a living cell, the changes are random. All of these genetic changes, supposedly, that has converted a single cell into people were caused by mutations, and they are random accidents. They are genetic mistakes. You are the product of millions and millions of mistakes, according to evolution. All the bad mistakes were weeded out, and all the good mistakes were saved and nurtured, and here we have people as a result of all of this chance. Is it possible? On an earth assumed to be 5 billion years old, in a universe assumed to be 20 billion years old, for all of this to happen, let's take a quick look at this matter of probability. Here's the structure of ribonuclease. This is an enzyme. All enzymes are proteins. They're made up of amino acids. 20 different kinds of amino acids are found in present-day protein. Now, on the hypothetical primordial Earth, if you're going to generate amino acids, and there's no way really to do that, not under any really plausible primitive Earth condition, but assuming that you could, you would generate several hundred different kinds of amino acids. How did that living thing, on its way to becoming a living thing, manage to select these 20 amino acids? Nobody's ever figured that out. But anyhow, in modern proteins, there are only 20 different kinds of amino acids. They are arranged in precise order. I'm not going to say anything about the difficulty getting these things joined together chemically. That doesn't happen naturally, spontaneously, not at all. They don't want to do that. They want to break apart. But let's assume that they wouldn't join together. How did they manage to get in that order? You see, when you arrange those 20 different amino acids in that order, you have ribonuclease. That's an enzyme, powerful enzyme, that helps your body digest the ribonucleic acid that you get in your food. That's all it does. Take the same 20 amino acids, rearrange them in a different order, 188 of them, and you have human growth hormone. Human growth hormone doesn't catalyze any chemical reaction, but it's a hormone. Then we have hemoglobin, the red blood protein, composed of 287 amino acids, arranged in precise order, different order. One is a hormone, one is an enzyme, one binds oxygen. Why? Why do they do that? And do it with amazing efficiency. Because of the precise arrangement of those amino acids. Now you can fiddle around some, you can rearrange some of those things, but not much. That structure is unique and precise. How did it happen? Well, of course, the evolution says by chance. I mean, what else has he got? He doesn't have any biochemist there. He doesn't have any engineer. He doesn't have any creator. He doesn't have any intelligence. Everything just banging around at random. And somehow, randomly, they got together and just happened to produce an enzyme. Ladies and gentlemen, that's this 20th century mythology that I'm talking about. That will never happen. I don't care if you have 500 billion years or 5,000 billion years. What's the probability that you could arrange by chance those 124 amino acids in that order? Well, I like to illustrate it this way. Some of you heard me do it already. Let's take the biggest thing we know much about, and that's the universe. Now we take the smallest thing we know much about, and that's electrons. Let's just jam-pack the universe, absolutely, totally jam-packed solid with electrons. There's not 1 cubic inch of space left over. Now we put your name on one of those electrons and send you out in the universe to find the electron with your name on it. By the time you found that electron with your name on it, we will have arranged those 124 amino acids by chance. Doing it, trying it 1 million times a second. Well, you know you could hunt for trillions times trillions of years and much more and never find the electron with your name on it. But if we did just happen to get that structure, or one that worked, what would we have? One single molecule of one single protein. But in an ocean containing 350 million cubic miles of water, you've got to have billions of tons each of hundreds of different kinds of protein, billions of tons each of hundreds of DNA and RNA molecules, lipids, carbohydrates, and much more. What is the possibility of that happening on this earth in 5 billion years? Absolutely nil. But if you have the ocean just swarming with all of these proteins, I'll give you any protein you want. I'll give you any DNA and RNA molecule you want. I'll give it to any quantity you want, and you still not get a living cell. Because those molecules would have to get together and start working together and cooperating together. Now remember, they don't do that naturally. The second law of thermodynamics says the tendency is to go in the other direction. Organized systems tends to break up and deteriorate and decay. These molecules have no tendency to get together in any meaningful, complex metabolic cycles. You'd have to do that. And you'd have to construct membranes and energy factories and protein factories and genetic material. And then you'd have to arrange it in just that order before you have life. Those things don't do that. They don't do that. No scientist ever seen anything like that happen. The tendency is to go in the other direction. What is the probability that that would happen? Well, of course, it's just nil. Here's an article that appeared in the Daily Express of London in August 14th of 1981. Two skeptical scientists put their heads together and reached an amazing conclusion: there must be a God. Well, I didn't realize that was such an amazing conclusion, but it was to these two scientists, because when they began their studies, they were both atheists and evolutionists. By the way, let me make clear, not all evolutionists are atheists. As a matter of fact, most are not. They believe God's out there somewhere, but he didn't have anything to do, you see, with this process. If he's a creator, he didn't create anything, see, in this view. Well, these two were atheists. An evolutionist. Who were they? Sir Fred Hoyle, if not the world's foremost astronomer, at least one of them, and Dr. Chandra Wickramasinghe. Professor Wickramasinghe is professor and chairman of the Department of Applied Mathematics and Astronomy at the University College in Cardiff, Wales. Well-known astronomer in his own right. These two scientists became interested in the problem of the origin of life a number of years ago. They made certain assumptions about the minimum requirement for a living cell. They calculated the probability of that happening on this earth in 5 billion years. The probability turned out to be one chance out of the number 1 followed by 40,000 zeros. Well, obviously that's just flatly zero. So they said, quite obviously life did not evolve on this planet. But after all, the universe has 100 billion galaxies. Each galaxy has 100 billion stars. Let us assume that every star in the universe has a planet like the Earth. Let us assume the universe is 20 billion years old. Now let us calculate the probability of life evolving somewhere in the universe in that 20 billion years. The answer came back. The probability was not insensibly different from zero. You could just forget about it. There was no probability that life had evolved anywhere in the universe, even in 20 billion years. Sir Fred Hoyle said the probability of evolution is equal to the probability that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard would assemble a Boeing 747. Well, as I always say, I tell people, if you want to believe that, that's okay, but we must not call it science. I've flown on a 747 many times, and I'm very happy it was not put together by a tornado. Now, even if we could get a living cell, even if we started with a living cell, you calculate the probability that you make these random, accidental changes, mutations, almost everything which is bad. Once in a while, a rare one is good. Assume that. Assume that there's some way to select that. Calculate the time it would take to convert a single cell into people, and it's billions of times longer than 5 billion years. It would never happen by such a process. Something had to create had to apply intelligence. Engineers, biochemists, all of that, you see, just as our engineers were able to design and build a spacecraft to get to Mars. Why were we able to get a spacecraft to Mars? Because not one single thing was left to chance. We never would have got there, no matter how many billions of years we tried, by chance. That's the same is true here. Well, let's leave this area which is dealing with the possibility of evolution. Could it occur? Is it physically possible? The laws of science say emphatically no. Anybody who believes that just believes it, contrary to the facts of science. Let's look at the fossil record now. That is a record of what has really taken place in the past. Now, according to evolutionists, millions of species have gradually evolved during 3 billion years. Millions of species. Now, if millions of species have evolved during several 100 million years, or many hundreds of millions of years, there would be a vast number of intermediate forms, or transitional types. Billions times billions times billions of intermediate forms would have lived and died during those billions of years. Our museums have 250,000 different fossil species, represented by tens of millions of cataloged fossils. We have a tremendously rich fossil record. Tens of thousands of those fossils should be intermediate, undoubted intermediate, no question. There should be no debate, there should be no question, there should be no doubt about the fact of evolution. We could go in any natural history museum, and there we would see these transition forms showing a little microscopic single-cell organism becoming a multicellular organism, then evolving into sponges and jellyfish and sea urchins and things like that. And then we should have intermediates showing one of these invertebrates, maybe a sponge, maybe a worm, maybe a jellyfish, who knows what, gradually changing into a fish that has an internal skeleton. 100 million years involved in the evolution of invertebrates to the fish, according to evolution. 100 million years. Our museum should be overflowing with the intermediate, showing what evolved into a fish and how it took place. We should have many, many intermediates showing the fin of the fish becoming feet and legs of the amphibian. We should have many intermediates showing the scale of the reptile changing into feathers and forelimbs into wings. We should have many intermediates showing apes becoming people, if evolution is true. There should be no doubt. We shouldn't have to refer to 2, 3, or 4 suggested intermediates. There ought to be tens of thousands. On the other hand, if creation is true, we would expect the fossil record would show that each basic type, what we might call created kind, would suddenly appear in the fossil record complete right from the start. Fishes are fishes. Sponges are sponges. Birds are birds. Canaries are canaries. Eagles are eagles. Monkeys are monkeys. Apes are apes, and people are people, right from the start, first time you see them. We would not expect to find intermediate forms, transitional forms. Each basic type would stand separate and distinct, with no evidence that it had arisen from a common ancestor. It seems to me that the contrast is as sharp as day and night. It seems to me it ought to be a simple job to go out there, dig up the fossils, study them, classify them, and then see which model the data fits best. Well, let's take a look. Let's do that. Now, first of all, even many prominent evolutionists, paleontologists, experts in the fossil record are now declaring there is little or no evidence for gradual change in the fossil record. Darwin knew that the fossil record was an embarrassment to his theory. He used one whole chapter in his book trying to explain away the fossil record, why we don't find transitional forms. They couldn't find those missing links. Well, we're 125 years after Darwin, and the missing links are still missing. That's being admitted by more and more paleontologists, and they're trying to come up with some way to explain away the fact that we cannot find those transitional forms. Some evolutionists realize the fossil record is so bad for evolution, why they say we really shouldn't even try to use the fossil record to support evolution. Mark Ridley is a British scientist and evolutionist in an article published in New Scientist, the 25th of June, 1981, on page 830. Ridley, this evolutionist, says, quote, "No real evolutionist uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creation." End of quote. What did he say? No real evolutionist would do that. No real evolutionist would even try to use the fossil record to defend evolution versus special creation. Why not? What better evidence for evolution would you have than that actual historical record showing the changes of one kind into another? Should be the best evidence that you could find. But he says no real evidence, no real evolutionists would do that. Now, if Dr. Nelson tries to do that tonight, then according to Dr. Ridley's definition, he's not a real evolutionist. Well, why wouldn't you? Well, it's just a bad thing. When I debated Dr. Beverly Halstead at Reading University in England a number of years ago, he told the audience, and I was surprised that he even revealed this, he said he went down to the British Museum of Natural History and talked to a paleontologist. He didn't say who it was. And wanted some advice about the debate. He said that paleontologist told him, whatever you do, don't mention fossils, because if you do, you'll get massacred. Well, that paleontologist must have known something, sitting there among one of the greatest collection of fossils in the world. Dr. David Woodruff in Science, volume 208, 1980, on page 716, made this statement: fossil species remained unchanged throughout most of their history, and the record fails to contain a single example of a significant transition. End of quote. Now, did you hear that? By an evolutionist? The record fails to contain a single example of a significant transition. I am not quoting him out of context. I have not distorted what this man is trying to say. That is what he has said. If he didn't mean it, why did he say it? There's not a single example of a significant transition in the fossil record. David Kitts, professor of geology at University of Oklahoma, a vertebrate paleontologist, got his training under George Gaylord Simpson. Certainly an evolutionist, one of the two evolutionists that my colleague Dr. Morris and I debated on that campus a number of years ago. During the debate, Dr. Kitts turned to us on the stage and he said, well, the gaps are real and they are a problem. A couple of years after that debate, Dr. Kitts published an article in the journal Evolution, volume 28, 1974, about the relationship of the fossil record to evolutionary theory. He was discussing the problem of the gaps, the absence of transitional forms. And on page 467 of that article, Dr. Kitts makes the following statement. He says, I quote, "Despite the bright promise that paleontology provides a means of seeing evolution, it has presented some nasty difficulties for evolutionists, the most notorious of which is the presence of gaps in the fossil record. Evolution requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them." End of quote. Although evolution requires these transitional forms, the fossil record does not produce them. There it is, stated in black and white, in perfect context. Why then is Dr. Kitts an evolutionist? Certainly not because of the fossil record, but in spite of the fossil record. And that fossil record is the most critically important evidence available. Dr. E.J.H. Corner is a botanist at Cambridge University. He is an evolutionist. He does believe that plants have evolved. But in a book called Contemporary Botanical Thought, published in 1961, this expert on the fossil record of plants, this evolutionist, on page 97 of that book, made the following statement. He says, and I quote, "Much evidence can be adduced in favor of the theory of evolution, or in favor of evolution, from biology, biogeography, and paleontology. But I still think that to the unprejudiced, the fossil record of plants is in favor of spatial creation. End of quote. Now, why did he say that? Why does he say this? It's because every major plant kind have appeared instantaneously fully formed. The angiosperms, the flowering plants, 42 families or 43 families appear fully formed. Supposedly they evolved from gymnosperms, the seed-bearing plant. There are no transitional forms. Where did the gymnosperms come from? They postulate they came from some simpler plant, but there are no record of such an evolutionary transition. So he says, if you are unprejudiced, you must admit the fossil record of plants favors spatial creation and not evolution. A friend of mine visited London a few years ago. He picked up a book called Evolution by Dr. Colin Patterson. Dr. Patterson is a senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History. Dr. Patterson invited comments from the readers. So my friend, who is a creation scientist, wrote to Dr. Patterson, complimented him on his very fine book on evolution. And then he said, Dr. Patterson, it would have been helpful if in your book you had supplied examples of actual transitional form. At the very least, perhaps you could have had an artist illustrate what you think these things look like. Dr. Patterson, in a letter dated the 10th of April 1979, replied to my friend, thanked him for his letter, then he made the following statement that we see on the next slide. I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest that an artist should be asked to visualize such transformations. But where would he get the information from? I could not honestly provide it. And if I were to leave it to artistic license, would that not mislead the reader? End of quote. All right, here we have a senior paleontologist, expert on the fossil record, sitting among one of the greatest collection of fossils in the world. And he says, you're right. I don't have any examples of transitional forms in my book. But if I had known of any, either among the living or among the fossils, I certainly would have included them. How can it be stated more plainly, more to the point, more candidly than what this man has said? Certainly, he's not trying to help the creationists. He's not a creationist. He has some very serious doubts now about the theory of evolution. He said he woke up one morning and realized he didn't know one single thing about evolution. He'd always believed that he did. Now he realizes he knows nothing about it. He said, as far as these evolutionary trees are concerned, all we have are the tips of the branches. Anybody who pretends to tell you how the trunk and the branches came off, they're just telling stories of one kind or another. Just storytelling. And he went on to say that the Darwinists who propose mechanisms for evolution, it's all empty rhetoric because no one really knows. Now that shakes up a lot of people when the senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History would say something like that. Derek Ager, another Britisher, geologist at Swansea in Wales, a bitter anti-creationist, by the way, in his article, The Nature of the Fossil Record, published in the Proceedings of the Geological Association, volume 87, 1976, made this rather candid statement. He said, and I quote, "It must be significant that nearly all the evolutionary stories I learned as a student have now been debunked." End of quote. Practically every evolutionary story he learned as a student has now been debunked. There have been a lot of stories debunked. But I tell these evolutionists not to worry, because when this generation is busily debunking the evolutionary stories of the previous generation, they're just as busily generating their own, which will be debunked by the next generation while they're generating their evolutionary stories. So we all have some evolutionary stories. Yes, it's true And I could describe many examples which were taught students, and beautiful examples. They look so beautiful, so easy to teach, so convincing, that now have been thrown out, known not to be evolution, environmental influences, and so forth, having nothing to do with evolution. Now let us look at some specific examples. First, we want to take a look at human origins. Now, evolutionists have a very sorry record in this field, in search for man's fossil ancestry. You see, you can become famous overnight when you find a fragment of a jaw or a skull or something like that, and you make bold claims, extravagant claims about it, and you declare it to be this and declare it to be that, and all the press comes in, National Geographic publish articles about you, you get on television, and overnight you're famous and the money flows in, and you go out and give lectures and get $2,500 per lecture, which Donald Johanson does. So you see, there is a very great tendency here to see something that isn't there, because really you're expecting to see it. The person is not necessarily dishonest. He just tends to see what he's expecting to see, what he thinks he ought to be able to see. And we have some examples. Here's the famous Piltdown Man. I got this from a 1937 issue of Life magazine. Here's the Piltdown Man, constructed from a few fragments of a jaw and a few fragments of a skull, found in a gravel pit near Piltdown, England in 1912. The jawbone was quite ape-like, the skull was quite man-like, but all of these things look to be very old. They put it all together and declared that this was the world, that is, this is the oldest Englishman, 500,000 years old, a subhuman ancestor of man, combining these ape and human features. Until 1950, a chemist demonstrated these bones were a hoax. It was shown that that jawbone was of a modern ape. It wasn't 500,000 years old. It wasn't any older than 1912. The skull was a human skull. Somebody had treated them chemically to make them look old, had filed the teeth with a file to make them look man-like, planted the bones in the gravel pit, and fooled the world's greatest authorities. And here was taught to our students, here's what's taught to our students for half a century as undoubted evidence for man's evolution, nothing but a modern ape jaw and a human skull. Now, in 1922, a single tooth was discovered in western Nebraska, brought to the attention of several of the leading authorities of that day. They were very excited by the discovery of this tooth. It seemed to have a number of features which they would expect for a transitional form between ape and man. They weren't quite sure whether it was a man-like ape or an ape-like man. The Illustrated London News had their artist draw a picture of this creature based upon the descriptions of the scientists. Published in the Illustrated London News in 1922, here we see the picture of this creature, the famous Nebraska man. Picture of his wife, pictures of the tools they were using, all based upon that one single tooth. Isn't science a fascinating subject? You can get such wholesale production of conjecture from such a trifling investment of facts. Well, a few years later, they discovered some additional remains of this creature. He turned out to be neither a man-like ape nor an ape-like man. He turned out to be a pig. That's right. It was a pig's tooth. Now, these scientists were honest. They were sincere and very capable scientists. Why did they mistake a pig's tooth for something like this? Because they wanted to find something like that. They expected to see something like that. They were seeing something that wasn't there at all. And here's another example. Neanderthal man. Some fossils of this creature were discovered back in 1860. Eventually fossils were found throughout Europe and North Africa and in Israel and other places. And some of these creatures seem to be very primitive. One nearly complete fossil, kind of hunched over, wasn't quite erect. So they said he couldn't quite walk erect. He was still on his way up from the apes. And he had sort of some eyebrow ridges, other primitive features. So the museum exhibits all showed Neanderthal man as a long-armed, knuckle-dragging, beetle-browed, stoop-shouldered, bow-legged subhuman. Homo neanderthalensis. He had not yet reached Homo sapien. He was not yet man. He was our subhuman ancestor. Finally, when X-rays became available, they X-rayed the bones and teeth of all these Neanderthal people. They all suffered severely from rickets, a vitamin D deficiency which causes softening of the bones. They didn't get enough vitamin D. Their bones were soft and they became deformed. They discovered the skeleton on which they based this creature here was an arthritic old man. He had a bad case of arthritis and couldn't walk upright. And he had other bone diseases. They finally decided all these primitive features were due to pathological conditions and had nothing to do with genetics at all. And they finally concluded that Neanderthal man was Homo sapien, modern man. And here we have the picture of the modern version of Neanderthal man. About 25 years ago, a couple of scientists published an article in which they said, now really, if you just take Neanderthal man, give him a shave and a haircut and a bath, put him in a business suit and place him on the New York subway, no one would take a second look. Well, that was 25 years ago, and of course today you wouldn't have to give him a shave or a haircut, would you? Some circles in San Diego, you wouldn't even have to give him a bath. And he'd do very nicely. Well, Neanderthal man was not our ancestor. He was man. Piltdown man was not our ancestor. He was an ape-jawed human skull. Nebraska man was not our ancestor. He was a pig's tooth. Ramapithecus, long held to be intermediate from ape and man, turned out to be an orangutan. And so it goes. Even more recently, they found a skull cap in Spain, near the village of Ors. They thought it was a skull cap of a human being, the oldest fossil man ever found in Europe. They called him Ors man. And they sent out 500 invitations to come there and study this skull cap in a symposium until some French experts pointed out that it was a skull cap of a donkey. Not a human skull cap at all, and they mailed out 500 letters revoking all of the invitations, the red-faced authorities in Spain. Well, 1912, it was an ape's jaw. 1922, it was a pig's tooth. Or modern man, Neanderthal man. And lately, Ors man, a donkey skull cap. It seems like the actors change and the props change, but the script remains the same. Let's look at one specific example now. Australopithecus. Here's a creature first discovered in 1924 in South Africa. More recently, Dr. Louis Leakey and his wife Mary discovered a skull in East Africa. And even more recently, Donald Johansen has found a series of fossils in Ethiopia to which he gave the name Australopithecus afarensis. One of which was a female, about 40% complete. He called her Lucy. And he's become famous for Lucy. Now he says she was 8 from the neck up. They reconstructed a skull from fragments of three individuals, and it looked like a small female gorilla. But he said it walked upright. Look at these things. Obviously, grossly ape-like. Sagittal crest, bony ridge across the top of the skull, no forehead. Apes. But they say they walked upright. And that's what we read in our textbooks, and what we see on television, what we see in National Geographic. This is the conventional wisdom. But there are some scientists who don't believe that. Now, these scientists are not creationists, and they have certainly done their homework. They have studied these fossils for years and years. One of these scientists is Lord Zuckerman, Dr. Solly Zuckerman, for many years the head of the Department of Anatomy at the University of Birmingham, working with a scientific team for over 15 years, applying the most sophisticated methods of anatomy to the study of these fossils, concluded they did not walk upright. They were not intermediate from ape and man. They were just apes. One of his former students, Dr. Charles Oxnard, now professor of anatomy at the University of Southern California, director of their graduate studies, has studied the postcranial skeleton of these creatures, the foot bone, the leg bone, the hand bone, the pelvis, and so forth, for many years, using the best methods available. And he has concluded that these creatures did not walk upright. They probably had a mode of locomotion similar to the orangutan, a hanging, climbing mode of locomotion. He says certainly they were not intermediate between ape and man. I want to say that again. Charles Oxnard, Dr. Oxnard, in many articles claim that these creatures are not intermediate. Now, if you hear otherwise, it's a lot of baloney, frankly. And I have heard that from my evolutionist opponent, that Oxnard says these were intermediate between apes and man. Ladies and gentlemen, that's precisely the opposite of what he has said. He does not believe that they are intermediate. They're not ancestral to anything. They were just themselves. Now this is the central figure in human evolutionary schemes. Knock that out, knock out the Australopithecines, and there is just not much left. Lord Zuckerman, as I said, is an evolutionist, not a creationist. He's done his homework. He studied fossils, searching for man's fossil ancestry for many years. Finally, after all of these many years of research, Lord Zuckerman published a book in 1970 called Beyond the Ivory Tower. In that book, he had 2 chapters on the search for man's fossil ancestry. In that book, on page 64, published in 1970, Lord Zuckerman makes the following statement. Oh, I'm sorry, I want to show 2 versions of the Australopithecines, according to artists. Now, both of these artists were drawing these pictures for evolutionists. In the upper portion of the slide, that artist, notice, flat head, no forehead, that's true, but he gave him a human nose and the eyes of a philosopher. That sort of convinces you he's on his way to becoming people. But look at the slide in the lower portion. Here's another artist version, also drawn for an evolutionist. What does he look like? Like an ape. Ape's nose, everything ape, you see. You see what you can do with the imagination according to what you think you ought to see or what you want to see? Well, now the statement by Lord Zuckerman. Here's the statement by Lord Zuckerman. What does he say? He says, quote, "No scientist could logically dispute the proposition that man, without having been involved in any act of divine creation, evolved from some ape-like creature in a very short space of time, speaking in geological terms, without leaving any fossil traces of the steps of the transformation." End of quote. So Lord Zuckerman said, exclude creation, then obviously man must have evolved from an ape-like creature. But if he did, there's absolutely no evidence for it in the fossil record. No evidence. Man did not evolve. He has always been man as far as the fossil record is concerned. Now, here's the complex invertebrates that suddenly appear in the fossil record fully formed. Sponges and jellyfish and worms and brachiopods and sea urchins and sea cucumbers, supposedly having evolved from a little microscopic single-cell organism. Nobody has ever found one single intermediate. They find many fossils of microscopic single-cell bacteria, they say. Therefore, you could find fossils of everything in between, but they never find anything like that. All of a sudden, here they are. A jellyfish is a jellyfish, a brachiopod is a brachiopod, and a worm is a worm, right from the start. An explosive appearance of these complex creatures fully formed at the start. Exactly. Positive, powerful evidence for creation. They say one of these things evolved into fishes. It took 100 million years. Our museum should have tens of thousands of those intermediates. They don't have one. The first fish is a fish. Absolutely. Absolutely. The oldest known amphibian with feet and legs, not a single intermediate. Here's an exhibit in the Chicago Museum of Natural History, Evolution of Fish into Amphibian. On the right, the fish. On the left, the amphibian. In the middle, a remarkable transitional form. Half fish, half amphibian. Labeled inferred intermediate. Inferred indeed, strictly imaginary. Nobody's ever been able to find it, so the artists produce it. That's artistic license, not science. And here's a flying reptile. These flying reptiles, notice this pteranodon, long toothless beak, long bony crest, and a fourth finger, a very long fourth finger to support a wingspread of up to 52 feet, longer than the F-4 Phantom jet. According to evolution, that finger got longer and longer and longer and longer through genetic mistakes. And at the same time, would you believe it, other genetic mistakes generated the wing membrane, flight muscles, hollow bones, and finally we ended up with this creature, pteranodon. Wouldn't you suppose our museums would have hundreds of the intermediates? They don't find a trace. Flying reptiles just pop into the fossil record fully formed. It's true of flying insects. Flying insects just pop into the fossil record. No intermediates from a non-flying insect. The same is true of the bats. Bats are mammals. Supposedly they evolved from non-flying mammals. Not a trace. This is the world's oldest known bat. He is 100% bat. Well, we had some other examples. Archaeopteryx, the dinosaurs, and so forth. But we've run out of time, so let me just close with this remark, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe we'll come back and take a few more of these. Harlow Shapley gave us a choice. He said, either in the beginning, God, or in the beginning, hydrogen. I say the scientific evidence overwhelmingly demand, in the beginning, God. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 5-minute break. We'll be back to hear Dr. Nelson's remarks at around 8:20.
Do you hear anything? Is this microphone doing anything? I'm supposed to wear this, right? Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, the second thesis statement of the evening will be presented by the affirmative speaker. He's a professor from the Hoosier State of Indiana, Dr. Craig Nelson. His statement will be 60 minutes in length also. Dr. Nelson.
Actually, I'm not from the Hoosier State of Indiana. I grew up in north central Canada, at a little town called Mankato, up in Jewell County. Coming back today was a real pleasure. Got off the plane in Kansas City and in the middle of such a snowstorm that you couldn't read the signs because they were covered by snow. But by the time I drove a little ways, then I started kicking myself for leaving my camera at home because I hadn't seen the hills. Maybe it had been too long since I'd seen them, but the trees were all white striped up one side. And the further west I get, the flatter it gets, and the more you can feel of, I don't know, it sort of feels like God's country out here to me. I don't know how it feels to the rest of you. I'm really glad to be here. We've had an interesting presentation by Dr. Gish, but much of it was kind of pointless because, as he said, most evolutionists believe in a creator. So they believe in the beginning God. They believe that things have a purpose and that there's a meaning to existence. And so that's not what the debate's about. The debate can't be about that. That's just one form of creationism as Dr. Gish treated it. And in fact, he didn't make much difference between the various forms that you get by believing in a creator. However, if you read the publications of his institute, then you'll find that they advocate a very specific form of creationism, which is sometimes called spatial creation, which I call quick creation. And if you look in the materials they've prepared for the public schools, then it's not simply the possibility of in the beginning God, or that God is the cause of it all, or that it couldn't have all happened without God, that they advocate. They advocate something much more specific, much more dogmatic religiously, and much more devoid of scientific content. What they advocate is that the universe is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old. That all the fossils of the various periods were formed during a catastrophic event, the flood, except maybe for a few at the very top or bottom. That all animals were created, and plants were created together in a short period of time, and that variation in living things is very restricted, only within very narrow times. Now you know that evolution suggests something very different on each of these points, so we ought to be able to look at the world and tell the difference. Before I do that, however, I want to emphasize again that I am not attacking the idea of a creator. And perhaps the best way to do that is to take a line that Dr. Gish and his associates sometimes emphasize, and that is that most of the theologians in this country don't believe in his brand of quick creationism, flood geology. Indeed, you know, there was a law passed in Arkansas saying that if you taught evolution in classes, you had to teach a form of creation like they proposed for public schools. And it's interesting to ask, who were the people in Arkansas that asked that the law be overturned because his view wasn't science? Right, the plaintiffs in the suit asking that the law be overturned included the resident Arkansas Bishop of the United Methodist Church, the Arkansas Bishop of the Episcopal Church, the Arkansas Bishop of the Roman Catholic Church, the Arkansas Bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the principal officer of the Presbyterian Church in Arkansas, United Methodist, Southern Baptist, and Presbyterian clergy, all of whom petitioned the court that the law be overturned on the grounds that what Dr. Gish is advocating is not science, but religious dogma, and indeed, in their view, not very good religious dogma. Now, let me emphasize that my conclusion, or their conclusion, both of them, that it's not science, is not a narrowly based conclusion. Last year, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the collection of the greatest scientific minds in this country, published a report on science and creationism. And they said that it was their unequivocal conclusion that creationism is not science. And I'll quote here, moreover, whenever the evidence for creationism has been subjected to the tests of the scientific method, it has been found invalid. Right? The bishops in Arkansas were agreeing with the greatest scientific minds in the country that the stuff about a young universe, flood geology, all species created at the same time, is not science. It has no scientific basis. Now, Dr. Gish is very clever at blending together quotations. And I don't have time to unblend all the quotations he gave, but you'll remember when he was talking about transitions on humans, he talked about Lord Zuckerman's conclusion, how he'd studied for years and years, he'd used the best methods available, and he'd really done his homework. Well, it turns out that the key fossils, of course, are in particular collections. And so you can write and ask the curators who's looked at those fossils. They don't just ship them around the world at random. There's a list of who's looked at the fossils. Right? And it turns out that Zuckerman never studied any original Australopithecus material, but only worked from a plaster cast of a single bone that was distorted by fossilization and that he didn't correct for. All the stuff, Lucy and all her relatives, that Dr. Gish talked about first, and then he says Dr. Zuckerman refutes, he never looked at. Right? Dr. Zuckerman did his studies on this material in the 30s and 40s before most of the good fossils were recovered. He wrote a book in 1970 as an old man writing his memoirs, and he didn't go back and redo his homework. All right, so much of Dr. Gish's material is not terribly fair, let's say. Not terribly fair. So let's look then at the facts. Let's look at first issue, age. Now, Dr. Gish said, gee, let's don't talk about age. We'll see there's a good reason why he doesn't want to talk about age. Because what he'd like to do is to convince you that you're his kind of creationist and then have you use his materials in educating your children on the assumption that if you're his kind of creationist, then what he puts in the materials you should believe. You should agree with. He says, in fact, he wrote recently, last November, that nothing is more devastating to the case of evolution than the evidence on the age of the earth. That's how important he thinks it is. Nothing is more devastating, but he'd like to exclude it from the debate tonight, and I think you'll see why in a minute. A little historical perspective will help. Back in about the middle, let's say, of the 1800s, some geologists, including Lyell and Darwin, came up with the idea of the first real strong evidence that the earth was old. The physicists of the time, some prominent physicists, disagreed with them and believed the earth was young. So you have two scientific hypotheses, both of them scientific at that time, that were tested by the subsequent development of science. Let's see what happened in those subsequent tests. The first test came from a new discovery, the discovery that light takes time to travel. Now this has an important philosophical connection that's often missed. It means that since light takes time to travel, that when you see something, you're looking into the past. Right? So that the light takes 8 minutes to reach here from the moon. From the sun. Now if we look at the first slide here, I hope, and kill the lights, is that possible? Lights down. Does anybody see a slide, maybe projector on? Ah, that wasn't the slide thing. The slide thing stayed over here when I shifted. Let's try this one. Ah! Yes, we're getting somewhere. This is a view of the Milky Way. Now it turns out that the Milky Way is 100,000 light years across. Since if you look out in space, 1 light year, you're seeing 1 year into the past. If you can see 100,000 light years away, you are looking 100,000 light years into the past. With bigger and bigger telescopes, we have been doubling the age of the observed universe about every 10 years since 1930. And when we look out as far as we can see, near the end of that arrow, we're seeing out about 15 billion light years away. That's 15 billion years into the past. Now what you have, that is, the light took 15 billion years to get here. Okay, so you have a direct, obvious data contradiction to any idea that the Earth or the universe could be very young. Right? It's billions of years old. Indeed, the only assumption you have to make to do this, in terms of hundreds of millions of years, is that the brightest stars aren't placed near us. If you just assume the stars near us are average, aren't millions of times brighter than the ones in space, then you don't have to make any other assumptions. You do it by triangulation and relative brightness without having to assume anything about star types or anything. If you want to know that it's 15 billion years instead of a few 100 million years, then you have to use some other knowledge from physics. Now, what can Dr. Gish's group do? Well, what they've done is to say, gee, it really is big. Light really does take time to travel. So the universe, quote, must have had an appearance of age at the moment of creation. The photons of light energy were created at the same time as the stars from which they were derived. That is, they say, you can't believe the stars are there. You don't need, if you're going to create the light separately, you don't need the stars. Further, when we look out in space, we see things like these galaxies interacting with each other. But since the light, if the universe were only 10,000 years old, the light wouldn't have had time to get here. So Dr. Gish's group believed that God created the light from explosions that never existed in order to give the Earth to give the universe an appearance of age. The straightforward interpretation is, of course, to believe that the universe is in fact very old. Now note that the physicists didn't assume the universe was very old. They thought it was much younger than evolutionists did. They just found the data that shows how old it is. And indeed, if the universe were very young, this line of evidence would show it. We would only see out 10,000 years, light years, or however old the universe were, and every day we'd be seeing more stars at the edge. Instead, we see out billions of light years. Let's look at a second way of aging the universe. The physicists made another new discovery that Darwin and none of the geologists knew about, nobody knew about, called radioactivity. Radioactive dating then comes from the fact that when a radioactive element decays, the parent isotope decays and forms a daughter isotope. So that, for example, rubidium-87 decays to form strontium-87, which is one of the isotopes of strontium. What that means is that if you start with a moderate amount of rubidium over here on this side, through time, the amount of it decreases, and the amount of the isotope 87 of strontium increases, so that you can use the decrease in one and the increase in the other as a clock. And indeed, we make some ratios between them, and we say, gee, if the age of the universe were very young, then we'd find, using these ratios, and if we have a rock that's very young, if we form one in the laboratory, and we then make these ratios, the line's horizontal. If the line is sloped, then it's old. For these isotopes, once you get an appreciable slope, it's very old, like billions of years. Now the data points are the little round circles. And you'll notice that those data points match a straight line very well. It's not a very inaccurate method. Further, it is multiply self-checking. That is, we take a rock and we do this on it. Now it's possible, just possible. There are some rocks where you get a false date out of one line, so we do multiple lines on the same rock. And then we can even, on many of them, do fission track dating. And we find they all agree within the error limits. That is, if it appears to be about 4 billion years old on one, it's usually about 4 billion years old on all of them. And those are the dates we use. We call them concordant across various lines of evidence, as well as isochronous. Now, what can Dr. Gish's group do with this? Again, a flat contradiction based on a brand new discovery in physics. Right, you start with two scientific hypotheses, you completely contradict it once, you find another new discovery, and you completely contradict it again. Well, they get kind of interesting. They say, first of all, down here at the bottom, and all the quotes I'm using are coming from Dr. Gish or from him, he's the associate director, or assistant director, what is it? And Dr. Morris is the director. So they all come from one of the two of them. So I'm not mixing up other schools of religion with them. They're all from their institute. They say, gee, there are now a few cases where there's agreement. Right? That is, they agree there are concordant dates that look like the rock is very old. They then say, gee, we would expect them to be old, and we would expect them to be in the right order through the geological column. Now that's pretty bold, huh? They agree that the dates look old, and they agree that they go from older to younger in the geological column. But they say, you shouldn't believe them. Why shouldn't you believe them? Because it's like with the stars, you know. God faked the data so the rocks would look old and deceive us in order to give the universe an apparent age. God didn't want to tell us it was young. He wanted us to guess it. Now again, note that with this method, that we could have found that the universe was young. We really could have. We could have went out there and done the rocks. The physicists could have said, hey, you know, you evolutionists are all wrong. This place hasn't been around here very long. But instead, they went fishing twice, found brand new discoveries that nobody could have predicted, and both of them show that it's a very old place. A third brand new discovery, right? Paleomagnetism. It turns out that many kinds of rocks maintain both the orientation and an indication of the strength of the magnetic field at the time they were formed. Right, now Dr. Gish and his associates have written articles about this, and I'll quote one written by Dr. Gish. He says, extrapolating the observed rate of the apparently exponential decay of the Earth's magnetic field, the age of the Earth or life seemingly could not exceed 20,000 years. What would that mean? The seemingly exponential decay. That means that if you start now and go backwards in time, looking at older and older artifacts, some human artifacts can be dated this way, and older rocks, that the magnetic field becomes stronger and stronger till by 20,000 years ago, it's impossibly strong. So that if we were to look at the data, we'd expect to find it starting out at the present strength, and as we go backwards in time, it gets stronger and stronger. All right, well, in fact, that's what it does. If you start out at the present and you go backwards in time, for 2,000 years, it gets stronger and stronger. But he said it was going to keep getting stronger and stronger. Instead, the data turns around And by 6,000 years ago, 4,000 BC, the field is actually weaker than it is now. So that the data flatly contradict, all except the first part of the data, flatly contradicts Dr. Gish's interpretation. Now, usually in science we don't consider it terribly fair to only use the first part of the curve. However, paleomagnetism has significance that goes well beyond simply this dating method, this false dating method that Dr. Gish's crew has proposed. It actually provides a third major physical discovery that shows that the Earth is very old. Right, because if you go in the bottom of the ocean, I have a slide slightly out of order. This one says, gee, if you'd like some references on what I'm doing, if you'd like a book to read that will show you these arguments, and if you'd like one that's written for non-scientists, try Kitcher's Abusing Science, the Case Against Creationism. If you'd like one that gives more information on the technical literature, try Godfrey's Scientists Confront Creationism. And if you'd like a journal that sort of summarizes many of the arguments and shows what the scientific evidence is, try the journal Creation/Evolution. Now let's see if I get the slide I think I've got. Yes. If you go out and look in the bottom of the ocean, then you find that in the middle of the ocean, say along the Mid-Atlantic Trench, that the magnetic field preserved in the rocks at the bottom of the ocean, the surface rocks, has its field pointing north. As you go out further, then it has the North Pole was the South Pole, so the magnetic field was reversed. And then north, and then south, and then north, and then south. Right, dark bands are North Pole north, white bands are North Pole south, and you'll notice that the pattern's symmetrical on each side of the ridge. The geologists now tell us that what this is that the crust of the Earth rises at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and spreads both ways. And as it solidifies, it preserves the magnetic field of the time it's preserved. So you see a pattern of magnetic shifts backwards through time. Right. Now, actually this figure is somewhat oversimplified because the whole thickness of the bottom of the ocean doesn't solidify at once. And so these slice under each other. And so this has been simplified slightly for illustrative purposes. But that doesn't change the conclusion. Now, to date these, we go out and look at islands going along from the middle of the ridge out to the side of the ocean. And using radioactive dating, we find the ones that are on the middle of the ridge date now, or within a million years of now. As you go out, you get a couple of million years, 10 million years. As you get out towards near the edge of the ocean, they're starting to date in the tens of millions of years. Right, all the islands in a sequence will be arranged with their dates in the right order. Right, so either the bottom of the ocean is spreading over tens of millions of years, or somebody arranged the radioactive dates so as to fool the daylights out of us. And indeed we find islands going down into the trenches and they're sucked under the bottom of the continents. And as they go under, they're melded, making mineral deposits. And the kinds of evidence that go with this, besides the middle of the ocean, is that that's where we find the deep earthquakes. That's where we find volcanoes, is over the trenches and over the ridges in the middle of the ocean. So that it has been termed the most major revolution in geology probably to ever occur. Certainly the most major one since we rejected quick creation. Now this has some further major importance. It turns out, well, if you look at what Dr. Gish's group says, they say, gee, the imagined evolutionary history of a region is of no value in explorations for fossil fuels or for ore deposits. That's Henry Morris in The Scientific Case for Creationism, page 77. However, what the oil companies discovered was that if you want to find Silurian oil, you find out where the coral reefs were in the Silurian. That is, you reconstruct where the continents were. You look on the east tropical sides, that's where the coral reefs will be. and you then find out where those have moved to and you drill there, and during the 70s the oil companies made billions using this theory of geology. Further, if you want to find metals, this is a figure from Edelson's paper in Mosaic. You look at deposits formed along the ridges and at deposits formed along the trenches, and that's where you find industrial and precious metals. So it has major economic importance, and rejecting this theory is to reject a major economic part of the base of the well-being of this country. It also has some impact on some of Dr. Gish's and Morris's other arguments. Right. For example, they have said, gee, and you'll find tables in the scientific case for creation and in scientific creationism and so forth, that say, gee, if you look at the rate at which minerals go into the ocean, and you see how much is in solution in the middle of the ocean, you can find out how long it would take to accumulate those elements in the ocean. So you can date the ocean on the assumption, of course, that everything that goes into the ocean stays there. But in fact, this mechanism shows that they aren't staying there, and there have even been pictures taken, like this one from the trench in the middle of the ocean, where you have hot water coming up, boiling out into the ocean, and you can see the minerals, actually metals in this case, precipitating out. All right? So that in the scientific case for creationism, you can always say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. This one invalidates 41 methods in one picture from the scientific case for creationism. All right, so in summary on age, the physicists started out with the presumption that the place was younger than evolutionists said. They discovered light, they discovered radioactivity, they discovered paleomagnetism, and all of those show, each of them could have shown that things are young, but instead they show that the place is hundreds of millions to billions of years old. Right, there are many more dating methods available. I don't have time to summarize them. All of them confirm that the universe and the earth are old and disprove a young universe. Physics is totally against a young earth kind of interpretation. Let's look at a couple of more issues that have been raised. Let's look at the issues of pattern in the geological record and at how the geological record was formed. Dr. Gish's group, when you read what they ask that you teach in school, says that all kinds were present at the beginning and that the geological record was formed in the flood. So we say that all species should be at the bottom of the geological record, all were created at once, and that the geological record was formed in a flood. Evolution, of course, says that the species develop gradually and that the geological record consists of a lot of local catastrophes together with segments that were deposited gradually over large areas of sequences of time. Fortunately, Dr. Gish's group agrees that the rocks are in the right sequence. You remember the quote on the radioactive dates ought to be in the right sequence. Right, so they agree, and indeed this is a table where they equate the flood, and this is from scientific creationism, it's not from Dr. Morris's theological writings, where they equate the stages of the flood with the stages of geology. Right, so they agree the rocks are in the right sequence. What do we find when we look at the rocks? Right, we find that at 3.5 billion years ago, we find the first fossil bacteria. Many of them are in stromatolites, bacterial reefs, big pieces of rock. All right. For 2 million years, we find for 2 billion years out of 3.5 billion. For more than half of geological time since the first fossils occurred, we find only bacteria. Over half of the time, only bacteria. Not everything at once, only bacteria. Then we find only simple single-celled organisms, some of which grew in clusters, but nothing like invertebrates or plants or vertebrates. And we have that for another billion years. So out of the 3.5 billion, we have to get up to about 700 million before we find the first invertebrates. And the first invertebrates are not all invertebrates together. They're the most simple, thin kinds. They are followed then by the Cambrian explosion. Dr. Gish says, gee, all these things appeared at once. Well, it's important to point out that geologists have a strange sense of time. Right? The Cambrian explosion was one of the slowest bangs in history. It was about 100 million years long. Right? So it was a very slow explosion. Then it's followed by jawless fish. Now, Dr. Gish likes to say these fish were fully fish. Well, they were, sort of. They didn't have any jaws yet. They only had 1 or 2 semicircular canals in the ear instead of 3. They didn't have any good fins yet, but we treat them as fishes. And he says he's never been able to find an answer. He said earlier tonight, he's never been able to find an evolutionist who would tell him why there weren't good transitions before these. Well, that's pretty simple. These are in freshwater deposits. Fishes apparently originated in fresh water, and they're in the oldest abundant freshwater deposits. Before that, we don't have a freshwater record. So now he has an answer that he's never been able to get. They weren't there because they were in the long ecological zone. These are then followed by jawed fishes. By jawed fishes, and then by amphibians, and then by reptiles, and then by birds and primitive mammals, mammals that are not like anything alive today. Right? And then most of 100 million years after the first mammals that are unlike what are around today, we start hitting mammals that are like the ones today, but very different. That is, you wouldn't confuse them with any of the kinds alive today. Right? Until about 30 million years ago. And only in the top 1% of the record do we find things like bees, or the kinds of flowers that are pollinated by bees, or any indication of humans, or that. Now notice that nothing could possibly contradict the idea that all species formed at once more than the fossil record. There's no way that the fossil record could conceivably disagree more with that interpretation. Well, Dr. Gish's group has to deal with this. How can they deal with this? The fossil record directly contradicts the idea that all species formed at once. They try another smokescreen. They say, gee, the fossil record is a result of differences in things like mobility. So that, for example, the kind of dumb animals were buried where they occurred. Things like amphibians ran a little faster. Reptiles ran a little faster. The primitive mammals ran a little faster, but the flood overtook them. And then those primitive primates in the fossil record that aren't like anything today, well, they weren't quite as good as the ones that made it to the top, and man made it all the way to the top less than 1%. Well, now that's a clever idea, you know. It's possible that things could run away from the flood. What they don't point out, of course, and what many readers forget to notice, is that the fossil record doesn't consist of amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. It consists of a whole lot of plants and a whole lot of invertebrates. So if this theory were to apply, you have to see something like, for example, the angiosperms only occur in the top 150 million years. But Dr. Gish's group says that they were created all at the same time, so let's pick a plant that lives down by the water's edge so that we get rid of the ecological differences, like a swamp oak. For this theory to apply, you have to envision a swamp oak running upward, plop, 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 through 90% of the fossil record. Now, everybody knows that plants can't run upward. The theory is nonsense. Right? Further, you have to envision that the primitive reefs with only bacteria were at the bottom, these are big rocks, were at the bottom of the record, that the rocks that had only bacteria and algae in them, they swam around these rocks for a while, and then they settled out on top of the others. And then came the primitive reefs, some of them 10 miles long with corals and sponges. And then came the ones with middle evolved corals and sponges. And then for most of the year that he thinks the flood occurred, the coral reefs, some of them tens of miles long, were swimming around in the ocean so that they could turn around and settle on top of the ones that had been formed before. It's just literally impossible, right? Nothing can be more improbable than the flood geological interpretation of the fossil record. Now, of course, it's easy to test their ideas. You know, we tested them when I was a boy. What they say is that when you flood something, the non-advanced tides run uphill. Right? We built a pond out on the farm when I was a boy. And when that pond flooded, I went out and watched. And as near as I could tell, I didn't have this theory in mind, so it wasn't a totally fair test, but I didn't see any evidence that the grass was picking up and moving, and it's only found in the top of the fossil record, that the insects were picking up and moving. In fact, organisms don't behave like the theory requires. And you clearly can test theories of origins when you make them specific like they've made them. Now, that leads you to wonder, when you have theories that are this flatly contradicted by the evidence, what kind of scientific evidence would lead them to change their mind? Well, fortunately, they've answered that question. Dr. Morris wrote back in 1970 that no evidence, real or imagined, can be allowed to change their mind. No evidence, no geological evidence, real or imagined, can be allowed to stand in the way of their presumptions. Now, if you have a presumption, and you say no amount of real evidence will change it, what do you call that? Well, you certainly don't call it science, right? You can't call that science, and they've clearly said, by any normal standard of science, that they're not doing science. Right. Well, let's talk then about the gaps. Remember that Dr. Gish's group agrees that things progressed from simple to complex. Remember again that spatial creation predicts that everything forms at once. So let's talk about gaps. What you see here, this is his prediction, that we'll have all the diversity at the beginning, and then as we go through time, we lose diversity as things are buried in the fossil record. This is an evolutionary prediction. We start out with only a few kinds at the bottom, and we get more and more diverse as we go through time, and we'll have some gaps where we don't know where things are. This is a fossil record of plants, summarized. Now, up at the top there, most of the fossil record isn't here because for most of the fossil record there weren't any plants at all, unless you count bacteria, no multicellular plants. But just the top part of the fossil record. And up in the top corner are the angiosperms. Now you'll notice there's a gap on the slide. We didn't connect the angiosperms to anything. Right? The gaps are real, many of them. Right? They are indeed something that we need to explain in science. But you might have gotten the idea from Dr. Gish's lecture that if the gaps are real, that supports his theory. But note that it doesn't. His theory predicts that the angiosperms will be all the way up and down the record. And they aren't. The gaps need to be explained by evolution. The fossil record totally contradicts any idea that all the species were formed all at once. If you want to say that each species was formed where you first find it in the fossil record, so that you have had creation with thousands or hundreds of thousands of acts through 3.5 billion years of time, that's one thing. All right? But if you want to say, as Dr. Gish's group advocates, that all the species were formed at once, there is no way within science that you can say that. And that is, the pattern flatly contradicts it. Well, he says, what about transitions? There aren't any transitional fossils, he says. For example, he wrote in a book called Dinosaurs, Those Terrible Lizards, Dr. Gish wrote on page 21, nowhere do we find in-between forms with spikes starting out as little spikes, which gradually got bigger and bigger. We're talking, and finally ending up as a Triceratops dinosaur, like this. And this is a quote, the first time you see a dinosaur with an armor plate on its head and with 3 spikes, he is a full-fledged Triceratops with a huge armor plate and with 3 big spikes. This is strong evidence for creation. Well, meet Monoclonius, a fossil that's found in the record before Triceratops. It has a plate on its head, it has 3 spikes, but it has 2 of them little. That is, there was already described when Dr. Gish wrote his book a fossil that met exactly the requirements that he said we should find. And we complain that his treatment may be a little unfair. And indeed, there's a whole family of album of these things. You have clear evidence of the transitions from small spikes to big spikes that he doesn't acknowledge. You have other things. For example, he has a cartoon, a lovely cartoon showing how a whale's udder should try to evolve. A cow's udder should try to evolve into a whale's udder. Well, the fossil record, the evidence for how udders evolved is utterly lacking, if you'll pardon the pun. But we do have some information on how whales evolved. For example, there are two kinds of whales. Toothed whales at the bottom and baleen whales at the top, which have stuff like fingernails in their mouth in place of teeth. They never have teeth after they're born. But in their embryos, the ones that don't have teeth after they're born, they still develop teeth and then resort them. Now that's perfectly comprehensible under the idea of evolution. What we like out of scientific theories is the ability to understand things. Evolution lets you understand why they have teeth. Dr. Gish's theory doesn't. They also have 5 fingers in their flippers, though they never use the fingers. They have a wrist bone like yours. They have 2 bones in the lower arm, 1 in the upper like you. Evolution lets you understand that. Further, they have at the back a pelvis, and in some of them, a thigh bone they never use. And in fact, it's non-functional. It's sort of fused to the pelvis. Evolution lets you understand why some of them could have genes for thigh bones. Dr. Gish's theory doesn't explain it. All right. Further, Dr. Gish's theory doesn't explain why, when we go back and look at the earliest whales in the fossil record, we find that some of them had pelvises like this that have sockets for good working thigh bones. All right. Further, it doesn't explain why the skulls look like this. At the top we have the skull of a horse. In the middle we have the skull of one of the early whales. At the bottom we have the skulls of the 2 kinds of existing whales, 2 major groups. Right. The stippled bones, the different stipplings indicate the different groups of bones. For example, you can notice that in the horse, as in most mammals, the nose indicated by the arrow is out at the end of the pair of black bones, out near the end of the skull. In the early whale, the nose is in an intermediate position, the bones are intermediate. In the advanced whales, the nose is moved up to the blowhole in the middle of the skull. Now, if you were to try to draw a skull that was intermediate between the whale skull and the generalized mammal skull as represented by the horse, what would you draw that was different than the fossil? What we have is a clear skull that's fully intermediate, or very nearly fully intermediate. That is, there are some features that are different, but the general total impact of that skull is clearly one of an intermediate. So again, we have a clear statement of a transition, just at the point where Dr. Gish likes to emphasize that we need one. That is, he says we need one in whales. All right, a third one. Let's talk a little about Archaeopteryx. Right? Dr. Gish doesn't like Archaeopteryx very much. He will give you a quote that says, gee, it's just a mosaic. He will even give you a quote from an evolutionist saying, gee, it's not a gradual transition form, it's a mosaic. But what he doesn't do is ask what a mosaic is. Back in the early days, we thought that evolution, that intermediates should be intermediate in all their features. We now know that the shift occurs in a mosaic fashion, meaning that some traits shift much faster than others. So that, in the case of Archaeopteryx, the reptiles that are in the record before it have already shifted to the same kind of feet Archaeopteryx has. They aren't using their front feet to run with. They're running around on their back legs like chickens. So that in the case of Archaeopteryx, the feet shifted first. The feathers are nearly fully bird-like. But the skeleton still has a lot of reptilian features. So that, for example, when we compare the skeleton of a bird with the skeleton of Archaeopteryx, we find that Archaeopteryx, unlike any other bird, has a long tail like a lizard. It had feathers along the length of the tail, but it had a lizard-like tail. All right, its pelvis is more lizard-like than other birds. Its wing pattern doesn't have the bones fused. You know, you've eaten chickens and know how the outer fingers are fused. They aren't fused yet in Archaeopteryx. The ribs are different. The breastbone's different. So there are a lot of traits here that are reptilian. That is, the skeleton shifted first to an upright posture, but then it stayed reptilian. The skull, this is a bird skull at the bottom. This is Archaeopteryx skull in the middle. That's a reptile skull at the top of a group related to it. Now, the interesting thing about Archaeopteryx is that it has teeth, but it's interesting to note not just that it has teeth. Dr. Gish has a funny line about things having teeth. He says, for example, that everything has teeth or don't. Some of you have teeth and some of you don't. And that doesn't have any evolutionary significance. What has evolutionary significance is that these teeth are the same as those in the reptiles and that are thought to be ancestral to it, and that reptiles come with a lot of different kinds of teeth, and that Archaeopteryx happens to have the teeth that are like the reptiles that are like it in terms of the rest of the skeleton. You can see that the skull of Archaeopteryx is in many ways, most ways, more similar to the reptile than it is to the bird. Now there are the eye's getting bigger, the shape of the front is changing some, the back of the brain case has recently been shown to be more bird-like than the reptile. So the skull is transitional, but you can see that on the average, the skull is much more like the reptile than like the bird. Indeed, the skeleton of Archaeopteryx is so similar to that of reptiles that most of the specimens of Archaeopteryx have been discovered in museum drawers filed as reptiles because you couldn't see the feathers on the fossil. And so what you have is an intermediate fossil that demonstrates our current idea of evolutionary change by being a mosaic. Now this is not, evolution tends to occur in bushes. Right, so you get a radiation and you only get snapshots of it, right? So that there are birds that occur with Archaeopteryx, so it's not the exact ancestor of the birds, but it's at a structural organization of the level you would expect to be ancestral to the birds, and the birds that are found with it are known from such fragmentary material that we can't say much about them. Now there's also, of course, a missing link effect. You can say, gee, well, how about the feathers? How could you use a halfway feather? Dr. Gish's group likes to write, how can you use a halfway thing? How can you use a halfway wing? Well, you can use a halfway wing to glide on. How can you use a halfway feather? Well, there's a fossil called Longisquama that has down its backbone a series of scales that are taller than it is. And the way they're arranged are the kinds of scales that male lizards, they're arranged to do the kind of thing that male lizards do in displaying to each other. So you evolve a feature for one thing, and then you find that it's useful for another. And that's how you use halfway things. All right, so we could go on with missing links, transitional forms, all day, but I'd like to turn to some other kinds of evidence for evolution. As soon as I figure out where I put it. And what I want to do is to talk about the biochemical evidence for evolution. If you look at the patterns of amino acids or of RNA or DNA, then you can line up the amino acids and find out which organisms have them most similar to each other. When you do this, you find that if you take the time we think they separated in the fossil record versus the number of differences in the amino acids, then you find that the more recently they've been together, the more similar their proteins are. And indeed, if we do this for several proteins, we find the same pattern but with different slopes for different proteins. That is, the proteins are working on a roughly, now I emphasize roughly, clock-like fashion. And we can use them to tell who's most related to whom. When we do this, we get trees like this, in which, as you would expect, man and monkey are pretty close. And the amazing thing that we didn't expect to get out of molecular biology, those of us who aren't molecular biologists, is that for some of the proteins you can trace the structural similarities back so that you can tell how we are related to yeast and plants. All right, so that the molecular biologists say that their evidence shows that all forms had a single common ancestor. Now you can't show that on the fossil record, but that's what the molecular biologists say their evidence shows. And indeed, in some of the proteins, it's clear that that's true. So we have an independent check on evolution. The molecular patterns are arranged so as to confirm our ideas of evolution. Now, how can this occur? Well, either evolution occurred, or somebody faked the proteins so that they would match the ideas we were going to have of evolution. Somebody made up the proteins, right? That is, the only way out is to go back to Dr. Gish's theory for light. Somebody's trying to fool the daylights out of us, right? But it's really much simpler to assume that evolution occurred. Now, there are also questions of how can you make major changes in evolution? It doesn't look like maybe there ought to be enough variation there. Well, we know some processes of macroevolutionary change. For example, in Raff and Kaufman's new book on embryos development and evolution, genes development and evolution, we find that, for example, we think centipedes are in one class, insects are in another. They differ in that centipedes have lots of legs, insects have only 3 pairs. So the question is, how can you transform a many-legged, relatively primitive in terms of structure, organism like a centipede into an insect with only 3 pairs of legs? And the answer seems to be evident from development. That is, the bottom is an adult of a primitive centipede, and the top is one of the developmental stages. What you have is a stage of the centipede that runs around on 3 legs, 3 pairs of legs, 6-legged centipede. And only as he grows older does he develop more legs. So if you had a developmental shift in which you emphasize those 3 pairs of legs and suppress the others, then you'd have an insect. When you look at some of the primitive insects, like this diplurin, then you find, in fact, that they have 3 pairs of legs they use and a series of other pairs down the sides of their body. Right, so one of the major ways of producing major shifts in evolution is by developmental pattern shifts. A second example of developmental pattern shifts is in fruit flies. Flies differ from any other insects in having only 2 wings, whereas other insects have 4. Flies have a pair of things called balancers. We've now found in Dr. Kaufman's lab at Indiana University that there are single genes that will transform the fly backwards, will reverse evolution, and turn the balancers back into a second pair of wings like most other winged insects. So again, you can have single gene shifts that produce large changes. Another way you can get large changes is by the process of symbiosis. All right, this is a protozoan that has bacteria on the surface that it uses to move with. It walks around on its bacteria. All right? And there is biochemical evidence that chloroplasts and mitochondria, and some people think most cell structure, originated by symbiosis, by small cells getting inside larger cells. So Dr. Gish asked, gee, even if you had a bag of proteins, how do you get all that structure? All right, well, one answer seems to be that you took different bags without much structure and put them together, with little bags providing structure for the big bags. A third way you get shifts is by gene duplication and by hybridization. So we have lots of processes of major evolutionary change. I've now shown that we know how new kinds of organisms can form, how we can make major changes, and I've also shown that most of Dr. Gish's basic ideas like old age, young age, flageology, and everything at once are simply wrong. Let me show you how much variation occurs within a species. All right, this is a pigeon. It's not a very good picture of a pigeon. These are more pigeons. They differ a lot in the feathering on the heads. These are more pigeons. You can get pigeons with wattles and rings around their eyes, the kinds of structures you get on chickens and turkeys. You can get pigeons that look like Wolf the Stilt, who was a KU when I was. You can get pigeons that look like me. More importantly, you can get pigeons with feathers all the way down their feet. Now you're beginning to get into really adaptive shifts here, because it's things like grouses and owls that have feathers all the way down their feet. You can get pigeons with very different beak shapes. Now you're getting really serious, because the major adaptive radiation in birds, the major adaptive differences depend on bill shape. And as you can see, you can get very different bill shapes in pigeons. You can get pigeons that look like quail or partridges. You can get pigeons that look like something you would never guess a pigeon looked like. That's a true breeding breed of pigeons. Now the advantage of pigeons is that everybody agrees that they were formed, all these breeds were formed in historical times from the dove of the Bible. Right, so all that variation has occurred within a few decades within a single species. And as you can see, there's no indication of major limits to the amount of variation you can get. All right, let me give you another example. The way evolution works is it takes that variation and it selects out, when you've got animals living in different habitats, the variation that occurs in random, the part that's adaptive in a particular niche, is preserved. So this is one of the Hawaiian honey creepers, thought to be the most primitive one. This is the radiation of Hawaiian honey creepers, and this is a nice example because Dr. Gish's group agrees that all of this is variation within kind, within a single kind. All right, what you've got is you've got birds with sparrow-like beaks, with warbler-like beaks, two with flower-probing beaks, two different lines, seed-crushing beak, fruit-crushing beaks. Indeed, you have within this kind an adaptive radiation in bill shape that encompasses half the birds in the world. And half the species of birds in the world will fit in this bill array. So Dr. Gish agrees that you can get this much variation within a single kind. The question then is, how do you decide what is a kind? Well, Dr. Gish says we've defined a basic kind as including all those variants which have been derived from a single stock. So these have all been derived from a single stock. And so every time we can show evolution, then it becomes a single kind. Well, that's all right with me, because when you look at the molecular evidence, then you will end up concluding that there's no limit to evolutionary change, this as this shows, and that the molecular evidence indicates that everything is one kind. And that is, after all, the basic point, right? That everything has a common ancestor, and that evolution occurred. Again, you can watch in Dr. Gish's for rebuttal for any evidence that the Earth is not very old, that the fossil record was formed very quickly, or that all the species were created at once. All he's given you evidence for so far is that the gaps are real, and as I showed you, when we take 3 of the gaps he's emphasized in his literature, we find that indeed the intermediates are there. The other thing he said, which I will address in my rebuttal, is that, gee, it might be unlikely that life originated by itself. Note again that I'm not arguing against in the beginning God. Most evolutionists believe that. What we're asking is what does the scientific evidence show about how God did things? How about what has happened since the beginning? And the evidence is clearly against Dr. Gish's model. Thank you.
In their fields, and in the name of academic freedom, you have come to an educational seminar that has taken many, many hours to prepare to present to you. And many educational seminars you would pay quite high price just to get into it. We didn't charge admission, but there is considerable expense. None of the offering taken, the free will offering taken tonight, will go to Westside Baptist Church. It will all go toward the expenses of Dr. Nelson coming from Indiana, Dr. Gish coming from California, and their expenses for speaking and being with us. And so I hope you'll consider that as you give. The men will go ahead and come on up to the front, I think, gentlemen, if you would, and start from the front back. And just go ahead and pass the buckets. And after we do that, we'll have the intermission, and then we'll be coming back after that for rebuttal.
for the